This is Lesson 10, the Great Depression. Here's our daily lesson as recorded in today's handouts. The Depression was global and marked with singular acts of selfish opportunism on the parts of a few and widespread, intense deprivation and misery for nearly everybody else. Above all else, the economic collapse was man-made and the product of intentional forces. Now, our daily objective after this lesson is you will read your assigned article, a contemporaneous article from the time of the Depression, and record your reactions, your reflections on what you have read. So today it's August 4th. It's Tuesday night, about 9:30 in the evening as I record this. America and the world are going through similar economic times as we did in 1929. There are in America more than 50 million unemployed. At the last quarter, the gross domestic product dropped by nearly 33%. The gross domestic product, that is the value of all goods and services in America, had for the previous 3 years been increasing about 2 or 2.5% per quarter. In the terms of economists, a recession is any period marked by 2 consecutive quarters of negative growth of GDP. Certainly 33% in this last quarter added on to the previous quarter's negative growth count as a recession. But these are very different times. In 1929, they did not have a contemporaneous public health hazard. Evictions of renters have been halted now for about 4 days, or that is, the prohibition against those evictions was halted by inaction of Congress about 4 days ago. Somewhere between 12 and 20 million American families may be thrown out of their rental homes in the days to come. These are the kinds of phenomenon that we saw during the Great Depression. On October 29, 1929, the stock market crashed. That is generally marked as the beginning of the Great Depression, here in America and throughout the world. Now here's what you must know about America then and America now. Then we were very much island America. What we ate, what we drank, what we drove, where we lived, were all American made. There were very few imports in those days. Now, the difference is stunning. American companies have gone, for the sake of reducing labor costs, into foreign markets and have flooded America with cheap goods. And that cheap goods are appreciated by Americans who have lesser buying power. But this is a tangled story that we'll explore later. What's important for you to know now is that in 1929, through the time of the Depression, America had been largely an island to itself in economic terms. Now, the first song that I really want you to listen to get a spirit of that time is Bing Crosby's Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? It is a very melancholy story about the Great Depression, about the way it affected people. So we'll take time and listen to that now if we're in the classroom, and if we're offline, you will go, if we're online, you will go to the posting I have from YouTube and watch this song and then reflect on it. What you will find is you will find a bittersweet tale about a guy who fought in World War I, the Great War, and who built the great railroads and who built the great buildings in American cities, and now is cast aside, standing in a breadline. Most of all, the story of the Great Depression is a story of how it affected families. Now, my father's father and mother both came from the small little village in Croatia. My grandfather, born in 1890, came here first. He lived in a boarding house that my maternal grandfather, great-grandfather, had created. And these were way stations for the immigrants. There they could speak their own language, they could eat their own food, they could be comfortable in one another's company as they became Americans, slowly, day by day, job by job, getting to know what it was like. When my grandmother came over in 1913 at age 12, she went to her father's home, this boarding house in St. Louis, and worked there, preparing the meals for the men boarders, cleaning the place, doing dishes, all that sort of stuff. And my grandfather, John Seddick, was one of those boarders. He apparently, according to my grandmother, sometime after they had met, pointed over in her direction and says, "That's the woman I'm going to marry." Now, he was 11 years her senior. He born in 1890, she in 1901. But sure enough, in April of 1917, they were married in St. Louis, and late that year, late in December, my father was born. First generation born here in the United States to his immigrant parents. Now, a couple of years later, in 1921, my grandmother and grandfather bought what they always referred to as their place of business. It was a nightclub, a tavern. It was originally called Seddick's Cafe at 1727 Park Avenue in the Lafayette Square area of St. Louis, for those of you who may be from St. Louis. It was a place that brought them respectability, an income, a certain amount of joy, a certain amount of status. They lived upstairs in a very elegant apartment that I had a chance to visit many years later, and it still had its same grandeur. Now, unfortunately, my grandfather died in 1928 at a very young age, so his widowed wife was set to run the place by herself and run the life of her son, her only son. And she did that as best she could. And then, a year after her husband's death, the Great Depression came. Grandma would often tell me about the money she had saved up for Joey's education. She wanted him to go to college. She wanted him to go to law school. He eventually did. But the money she had saved in the bank disappeared. 90% of it was lost in the collapse of the banks after the collapse of the stock market. So whether it was the Jodes moving from Oklahoma to California, or whether it was the Seddicks, this was a tale of families affected dramatically, drastically, and dreadfully during the Great Depression. Now, let's talk about the Depression and capitalism. First of all, let's start with basic concepts. There's income and there's wealth. Income is the money that you earn in a single year from your labor or your investments. Wealth is the accumulation of assets that you have, things that you buy, land, real estate, stock certificates, money you have in the bank. That's wealth. That's the accumulation of your savings and earnings over time. So you see, income and wealth are different. Now, the Great Depression was a story of capitalism. And I always ask students, and if we're in the classroom, I'll ask you to help me define capitalism. And most students are perplexed. They talk about free markets. They talk about the American way. Well, in fact, capitalism is defined by three principal traits. The first trait is that the means of production are held in private hands. Let's say, for the sake of argument, that you and your family own a herd of dairy cows. Those are the means of production. You own those cows, and therefore you look forward to the milk and cheese and butter that they will produce. The second principle of capitalism is that profit goes back to the private hands of the people who own the means of production. In the case of our dairy cows, the milk and all the other products that you produce and sell, that income comes back to you. That's the second trait of capitalism. The third trait is a little more mysterious and external. That is, a system of money and banking that facilitates the flow of capital from one place and from one individual to another. And that's where the government comes in and private banks come in. So those are the three traits of capitalism. Now, the stock market does not equal the economy. It didn't in 1929, and it doesn't in the year 2020. The stock market is merely a place that some capitalists go to collect capital. They get investments from small investors and from large investors who want to buy a share of a company, who want to share in the profits of that company or those organizations. So the stock market is a place where capital is created. Now, at the time of the Great Depression, there was far too little regulation. There was scarcely no regulation on these financial markets. The prices could be, and they were manipulated by a few for their own sake. There was a phenomenon during the Great Depression called buying on margin. And here's how it works. Let's say you have $1,000 and you want to get in on the stock market. This is 1928, early 1929. Things are going very well. So you go to a broker. He says, great, I'll let you buy on 90% margin. Give me that $1,000 and I'll buy you $10,000 of Ford Motor or whatever the stock may be. This is a great deal. Well, it was a great deal until the stock market collapse came. And when the stock market collapse came, then the brokers went out for what they called margin calls. So what you had to come up with was not just the $1,000 you'd lost, because you'd lost $1,000 of your own plus $9,000 that the broker had lent you. So you see, when the margin call came due, you were down the full $10,000. Let's say the stock went from $10,000 face value to $500. You had to come up with $9,500 just to liquidate your position. So buying on margin was very dangerous and very risky. Now, Herbert Hoover was a remarkable man, actually a wealthy engineer himself, trained at Stanford University, who worked in gold mines around the world before he finally got into politics. And his instincts were like so many who were in politics those days. They believed in the old principles of Adam Smith and the invisible hand. They believed that given enough time, the market would right itself, would correct itself. There would be a natural equilibrium. Well, that equilibrium did not come. He waited, and he made some mistakes along the way. One of the mistakes he made was he looked to prevent foreign goods from coming in. Now, there weren't that many foreign goods, but he looked to prevent them so that these goods could be made in America. So he applied tariffs. No fewer than 1,000 economists of the day encouraged Hoover not to apply the tariffs. He did anyway, and what happened is a tariff is just an extra expense paid by the ultimate purchaser of the goods. So Americans were paying more for imported goods, some of which they actually needed. Now again, a reminder between then and now. Then the American economy was composed of manufacturing and goods and construction and mining and all sorts of sectors. Our economy now is essentially 75% or more a consumer-driven economy. The meals we buy, the vacations we buy, the cars we buy, the homes we buy, all come out of family income. Now, there is a certain share that's purchased by companies when they lease airplanes to sell you an airplane ticket. But essentially, our economy, unlike then, ours is a service economy. So it's consumer-driven in terms of demand and expenditures, and it's a service economy. Very different from those 90-some years ago when the Great Depression came. So Hoover and his tariffs, it did not work out. He believed firmly that the economy was solid and would return on its own to a solid footing. He refused to push the Congress for relief programs, and in fact, relief government programs was very uncommon in those days. If you were poor in America, it was likely that you were going to be supported by the efforts of a county. There'd be a county poor farm. There'd be local taxes that would pay for poor benefits for widowed mothers and people like that. But there were no great programs at the state or at the federal level until much later. Now think about the disastrous depression in Europe. Remember, Europe had been the site of the Great War, 1914 to 1918. Those nations were still rebuilding. They were trying to rebuild their capital. They were trying to rebuild their economies. And when they had the financial crisis that came across the world, they were not prepared to deal with it. And these, of course, were the uncertain times in which Hitler made his move in Germany. It was also complicated by the gold standard, but that's a story beyond our scope. What I want to do today, as with all these days, is make you curious about the lessons you do hear about this Great Depression. Now I want to tell you about a conspicuous crook during the Depression. His name was Samuel Insull. He was probably the poster boy for financial dealings. As a matter of fact, when Orson Welles wrote his famous movie, Citizen Kane, he had two people in mind, Samuel Insull and William Randolph Hearst. His Charles Foster Kane is an amalgam of those two horrible people. So what Insull did is he created these holding companies. These were companies that didn't have anything on their own, they merely held other companies. Nowadays people call them limited liability corporations. He attracted investors to buy his empires of interurban railroads, power companies, radio stations. According to one report that I read, Insull personally had directorships on 85 companies, was the chairman of 5 boards of directors, and the president of 11 other companies. His was an example of the concentration of wealth. Now, he fled to Europe to evade prosecution, and he was eventually extradited to America, where he was tried 3 times and acquitted on all 3 of those charges. He eventually died in exile in Europe with about $1,000 in assets and $14 million in debt. The key thing to remember about Insull and other such unscrupulous practitioners during the Great Depression is, by and large, what they did was not illegal. It was wrong, it was morally wrong, but it was not illegal. Those types of treachery informed the improvements that America made in laws in the 1930s after a new president was elected. Now, I showed you the one music, the song called Brother, Can You Spare a Dime? During this period, Americans were also looking to escape. They would go to the movies and they would either see these dreadful tales that they were living, or they would see escapist movies like The Gold Diggers of 1933. Ginger Rogers and this chorus in the Busby Berkeley stage picture sang, "We're in the money. Old man depression, you have gone away." Well, it was wishful thinking, but people enjoyed spending their 10 cents or 25 cents to see this movie and to have a little escapism. I will show you another song that was written during the Depression, but the version I'll show you is by Judy Garland from 1951. The movie was called Summer Stock. The music is called Forget Your Troubles, Come On, Get Happy. Now, the reason I show you this is I have a particular point of view. I think this song symbolizes the escape that some people made to religion, specifically fundamentalist revivalism at the time. Because there was so much grief, so much despair, that people would look to the Lord, and they'd look for Him in tents, and they'd look for preachers with great promises. And that, I think, is what the song is about. You watch this song and you judge, because if you're going to wash all your sins away in the tide, forget your troubles, come on, get happy. Now remember, the Great Depression started with the stock market collapse, arguably October 29th, 1929. The next election wasn't for 3 years until 1932, when Herbert Hoover was voted out along with his Congress, and Franklin Delano Roosevelt was elected president. Now in those days, the president was elected in November, but did not take office until March. So it was 3 years and about 5 months between the time that Hoover and the Depression got started and a new regime came in, Franklin Roosevelt. Unemployment was still high. The public appetite for change was very great. Now FDR worked very fast. He had the cooperation of a Congress of his party, and he moved quickly. And in the first 100 days passed a lot of laws, including banking laws and the National Recovery Acts and all sorts of laws, which I will talk to you about in the next session. Some of these were terrific successes and immediate successes. Others were failures, and I will be honest in my portrayal of those. Now, many would argue that World War II was really the cause of the end of the Depression. And certainly by 1939, as American industry and business was building up, we were also preparing to help Europe and eventually help ourselves find our way into another world war. The Great Depression affected my family in many ways. My father was, in 1935, able to graduate high school, and then in 1942, as the war was advancing, he was able to graduate from law school, but not without tremendous sacrifice on the part of my grandmother. I want to read an article to you, and I don't usually do this, and I'm posting it on the slide where you can look at it. It's a story from the New York Times, October 30th, 1929. And as I read this, you will get an idea of how important it is to read the contemporaneous media. John J. Raskob was a very prominent investor and financier in New York City. This article on the next morning after the crash gives some idea what Raskob was thinking. John J. Raskob, one of the country's leading industrial and political leaders, declared last night in a statement to the New York Times that many stocks are selling at bargain prices and that he and his friends are buyers of stock. It may be stated in this connection, Mr. Raskob has been out of the stock market for many months and did not re-enter it until he believed the stocks had reached a level at which they could be purchased with safety. His statement, written at his desk last night, was as follows. Again, direct quotation from Raskob. Many of us long felt great concern because of the inflated condition of the stock market during the past several months. Huge amounts of money have been loaned in the call market at attractive rates during this period by people who ordinarily would not have invested in securities. The present decline in the stock markets in this country has carried prices in many instances to ridiculously low levels, with the result that nearly all the standard railroad stocks are cheap, and the industrial list is full of stocks selling at real bargain prices. In a panic, whether in a theater on fire or the stock market, people lose their heads and go too far, Raskob writes, which always results in needless and unnecessary suffering. Prudent investors, he writes, are now buying stocks in huge quantity and will profit handsomely when the hysteria is over and our people have the opportunity to calmer moments, to appreciate the great stability of business by reason of the sound, fundamental economic conditions existing in this great country. The pendulum has swung too far. The list is filled with bargains, and my friends and I are buying stock. Mr. Raskob was asked if he believed the decline in the stock market would have had great effects on business. He answered that he did not believe the effects would be other than temporary, probably lasting 2 to 3 months, and he did not believe the effects would be drastic in other than luxury industries. John Jacob Raskob was one of those horrible, unscrupulous people who could see what was going on, who was part of what was going on, who was part of the manipulation of prices of stock. He didn't need to borrow on margin. He had plenty of money, and he and his friends withdrew from the stock market cautiously, deliberately, so that when the crash came, as surely it would, they could buy at scavenger bargain basement prices and advance their wealth on the misery of others. 2 to 3 months, Mr. Raskob? You were wrong about that. The Great Depression affected John J. Raskob a little. It affected the rest of America and the world a great deal.